So there was a parish where the pastor had served for many years and finally reached the age where he could retire, and so he did. And a new priest was assigned to that church. And on the first Sunday, the new priest noticed that during the Eucharistic prayer, about half of the church was standing and about half of the church was kneeling. And he didn't think much of it at first, but then after Mass, a member of each faction came to him and explained to him that they were very frustrated because it had always been their tradition to stand during the Eucharistic prayer. And of course, the other half said that it had always been their tradition to kneel during the Eucharistic prayer. And it became very divisive in the community. And so the pastor that was newly assigned took a member of each group with him, and they went to visit the retired pastor. And so as they were meeting with the retired pastor, he let each of the groups speak one at a time. And so the first one stood up and said, "Father, isn't it true that it's always been our tradition to stand during the Eucharistic prayer?" And the pastor looked at him with love and he said, "No, that's not our tradition." And so then the other leader stood and said, "So then, Father, it's true that it's always been our tradition to kneel during the Eucharistic prayer." And the pastor looked at him with love and he said, "No, that's not our tradition." And so the new pastor said, "Well, Father, this is madness. Half of the church is standing, half of the church is kneeling. It's chaos every Sunday." And the retired pastor said, "Yes, that's our tradition." You know, oftentimes in the Catholic Church, we can get a little overly fixated on how to practice our faith. We talk about the beauty of adoration. We talk about receiving communion on the tongue or in the hand. We talk about the Novus Ordo or the Latin Mass. And we talk about all these different ways that we can practice our faith. But the second reading from Paul's letter to the Hebrews gives us an opportunity to talk about what faith does in us. And I want to talk about it through the eyes of Abraham in three ways, because Abraham in faith obeyed the Lord, and Abraham in faith sojourned with the Lord, and Abraham in faith gave new life. And so I want to talk about that. So first, obedience. You know, as Americans, I know that sounds like a negative word, obedience. We think that if I am obedient, that it makes me subservient to another person, that maybe I become enslaved by this other person because I'm obedient to them. The problem is obedience actually means to listen. The word, the root for obedience is to listen. And so in faith, Abraham listened to God. Abraham wanted to know what God was saying. Now, St. Ignatius of Loyola said that all of creation, the whole created universe, is God's communication of love to us. And so if you think about that for a minute, if all of creation is God's communication of love to us, then that means every single day, in every single thing, we have the opportunity to listen to what God is trying to communicate to us. But it takes faith to believe that God really wants to talk to us, that God cares about our daily lives, that He's interested in the ins and outs of our days. And so in faith, Abraham listened. He was obedient to God, and by listening, heard God's voice. Not spoken like a human voice, but he heard what God had in mind for him. And that involved Abraham in a sojourn. Now, sojourn's a cool word. It comes from French. And so if you ever go to France or if you meet somebody who speaks French, they're going to say, bonjour. Means good day, right? So séjour means to spend a day. And so to be a sojourner is someone who spends a day, maybe a little bit longer than a day, but not much more. A sojourner is someone who doesn't get settled down. They're constantly on the move. They're not attached. A sojourner is someone who recognizes that this world is not their final destination. And so in faith, Abraham sojourned with God. He was invited to go to a place he didn't know, to be among people he hadn't met, and to trust that wherever God would lead him, it would be better than anything he could have imagined. And so Abraham sojourned with God and didn't become attached. Now, of course, the alternative to that is sometimes we get a little scared. In fact, probably you've heard many conversations about people who don't feel safe. And you know what? We shouldn't, because we're not safe. This world is scary. This world is dangerous. This world will kill us. That's its intent. And so if safety is our ultimate goal, we will fail. Safety isn't our end. Our end is salvation. And a sojourner is someone who recognizes that no matter how much money, no matter how many possessions I accumulate, I'm still not safe. A sojourner recognizes that being attached to this world is really an obstacle to being attached to God. And so if we're really going to be a sojourner in faith, we have to trust that there is no material solution to what is unsettled inside of us. The only solution is in faith to journey with God, to sojourn with God, knowing that God is leading us to a place of safety that this world can't offer. And that's what leads us to the third. In faith, Abraham gave new life. Now, Abraham and Sarah were at an age where it was unrealistic to expect them to have children. It was ridiculous. In fact, it was impossible. It couldn't happen. Neither of them had the capacity to give life. But in faith, they received the gift of life, and they passed on the gift of life. Now, I'll never forget, it was probably 20 years ago, I was speaking with one of our mothers, and she was really wanting to do something for her children, and she recognized that the only gift that she could give to her children that they could keep for eternity was the gift of faith. And the gift of faith is life-giving. It's what gives us an eternal life. Human life is precious and sacred, and when we pass on the gift of life, it is an act of co-creating with God. It's a beautiful thing, but it's not enough. Because simply giving life isn't sufficient. We also need to give the gift of faith to the next generation. We need to be committed to passing on that gift of faith so that the next generation not only has life, but has hope in eternal life. And so Abraham shows us how to be life-giving. In faith, he trusted in God's promise to him. In faith, he recognized that God could do through him what was humanly impossible. And God invites us to the same realization, that with the eyes of faith, we can actually see and hear God's voice in the world each day. With the eyes of faith, we can travel through this life knowing that it's not our final destination and that God is preparing us now for what we can hardly imagine. With the eyes of faith, we recognize that we have been invited to share the gift of life, not just human life, but the life eternal that comes through faith. And that's what leads us to the gospel. In the gospel, Jesus tells a parable about 3 types of stewards. And a steward is just somebody who's been entrusted with a gift, right? And they're supposed to use that gift. And so he talks about the faithful steward, the one who receives the gift and understands how to use it and uses it for the benefit of others. And then he talks about the unfaithful steward, the one who receives a gift and uses it for himself. And then he talks about the ignorant steward, the one who receives a gift and doesn't even know that he has it. The scriptures today invite us to be faithful stewards, to recognize the gift of faith that is being offered to us and to use it for the benefit of others, to recognize that God indeed wants to speak with us. He wants to walk with us, and he wants to give us eternal life.